Hey there, Golden Bears! To infinity and beyond! That's Buzz Lightyear, of course. And I just thought of that. I was reading this title here, Toward the 21st Century. Well, we are now continuing our module 9.3 and drifting into presidents that you might be familiar with, namely Clinton, and some of the famous and not so famous aspects of him during his presidency. Well, with that, let us dive on in, or lift off in the case of Buzz Lightyear. This political cartoon, I think, says a lot about Bill Clinton as president. You do hopefully know that you wouldn't know, but he served 2 terms. And his first term was really a strong liberal agenda, being a Democrat, and really tried to work hard at dismantling some of the things that Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, number 41, had put into place. But then when he got elected to his second term, he had to really change his language and his verbiage and actually somewhat of his political stance on things. In some ways, he became more of a conservative. And so here you can see him in between his electoral, being elected and trying to run for re-election, is this policy of the federal government in terms of the military. And how are they going to handle the LGBTQ community? And so here you see a decorated, honorable a military person, okay, being asked by family or neighbors, we don't know. And here you see his last name of Gay, but it really is representing his story, okay, which he can't go around and tell people. And he is definitely, because of this policy, continuing to feel like a second-class citizen. What is this policy? The government's policy was that the government couldn't ask a military person if they were LGBTQ or gay, but they also didn't have to tell them either. And so this series of ambiguity didn't bring any clarity to the situation, and it kind of conveys a lot of what Bill Clinton was like. He tried to work in the gray in so many areas, and in that, there were some good things and some bad things, but for the most part, it's a presidency that is cloaked with things of, the Whitewater scandal and Monica Lewinsky, which we'll talk about here in subsequent slides. This is your worksheet graphic organizer for this time period, so please take a look at that as we unpack for the week. This will be a discussion that we will do in class, and that leads us to our learning targets. And there's quite a few of them, because this is where we begin seeing the world with computers beginning to accelerate at a rapid pace in terms of globalization. And this globalization, as point number 1 up there is talking about, is that it really creates greater free trade. And when there's greater free trade, you have governments working together. When you have governments working together, you have financial systems that are beginning to collide. And whether that's good or bad, it certainly created a track record, if you will, or a channel in which policies and government had to follow. We had a lot of debates beginning to emerge during this time with regard to immigration and diversity and gender. We saw the advent of the World Wide Web emerging and the role that it had during this time. And we see the sector of employment areas changing dramatically. We see a reduction of, we call them manufacturing jobs, leaving America and going predominantly down to Mexico or to other Latin American countries, and leaving a lot of people in America just kind of scratching their head going, wait a minute, why are we sending these jobs elsewhere when we need these jobs here? So those are some of the things that President Clinton had to address and had to walk through and develop some responses towards. Well, number 1, what was his domestic policy and economic policy? We're going to camp out a lot on this theme of his domestic and economic policies because, as I alluded to with 2-term president, there were going to be some things that were strong and some things that ended up being negative as he was seen. Well, point number 1 is after election of 1992, Bill Clinton was unique. I think he was a governor of Arkansas 4 terms or some crazy amount of number, okay, that he was there. And it was during that time he had a strong track record of improving education, bringing more jobs to the area, in reducing people who are on government rolls or payrolls, if you will. So he had a really strong track record, and he was able to topple the president in power, which was Herbert Walker Bush. Remember, who was the vice president for those 2 terms under Reagan. And this was a unique thing. I don't know if it surprised people, but people were really kind of bothered that Bush had a great track record kind of working on a global scale, but his domestic policies were leaving people wanting. The inflation was again starting to get out of control, and incomes were going down. And so Bill Clinton found himself in power. And what does this mean? He and the Democrat led Congress is going to begin dismantling the hard-worked, hard-won Republican Bush policies that have been put into place over the past 12 years. What was one of them? Is that he was going to raise taxes on the wealthy. We've talked about this. You see how that often Democrats will tax the wealthy and the Republicans will do the opposite. And that's just kind of a typical thing. But what made Bill Clinton unique is he raised taxes on corporations, which is not a good thing for Republicans per se, but he also attacked the other sacred thing the Republicans have, and that is spending money on military, because it was deemed appropriate all those years in post-World War II to spend money, because many people, that's what created jobs and therefore helped our bottom line, our gross domestic product. But what this really did is it helped balance the budget for the first time. And in fact, America under Bill Clinton got completely out of debt. Literally, we owed nothing. Now, if you were to look at it, we're in debt again by the trillions. Now, in some ways, that's a good thing. Remember, all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, he thought it was good to have Europeans on the hook for debt, because that made them want to make sure America remains successful. Nowadays, we have tons of debt with China, tons of debt with European Union, tons of debt with Japan. What does that mean? Is that we know that China, no matter how much we're saber rattling or saying what's wrong with them and us, etc., there's plenty of Chinese people and their government that make sure that they get paid due to the debt that they have here. So a unique aspect of Bill Clinton is he worked hard to bring a balanced budget and to get us a surplus, which summarily got kind of taken away by various things, but namely it was 9/11 that brought about that surplus depletion. He began continuing to work on ways in which abortion again could be formally legalized and funded through Planned Parenthood. These were things that the Republicans worked hard to dismantle. He is now bringing those things back. And he also approved the Family and Medical Leave Act, which is a big shift away from the Republican mindset of like, well, if you have a baby, sorry, maybe you don't need to be working, mother or father. But this was a unique thing where both either mother or father can each take, you have 90, I think it's 90 days. You don't get paid for those 90 days, but you can still take time off to spend with your newborn and family dynamic. And if you want to split it where your husband gets half and your wife gets half, it was a great, great policy. I've already talked about the don't ask, don't tell policy, but the one thing, I'll go to this thing here, is the health plan. His wife, she ran on the ticket with him as not being a conventional first lady. She's a bright, articulate woman that's well-spoken, and she said, when I come in and be part of my husband's agenda, I'm going to tackle the health care and bring health care to each and every one of America, because we believe that is a travesty that we are a global superpower, yet we have the poorest of our poor who aren't able to meet basic needs in their homes. And so this universal health care seemed to have a lot of sway with the Democrats. Of course, they were in favor of it, but the Republicans kept working hard at it. I love this political cartoon at the bottom that here's the scarecrow, just like in the movie The Yellow Brick Road. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but you have Wizard of Oz, thank you, in my mind. Wizard of Oz that finally showed up there. That all the straw is being removed. By whom? These lobbyists Who are these lobbyists? Lobbyists for the doctors, lobbyists for the healthcare profession, doctors for the drug companies. All of these varying agencies basically went and convinced a lot of Republicans and a few Democrats that by giving a universal health care will reduce choices and options for Americans, and it will detract from America having the best health system in the world and almost make it into a second-class one in that. So right, wrong, or indifferent, it did not pass, and so this became kind of a major defeat for both Bill Clinton and his First Lady, his wife, Hillary Clinton, during that time. Going on to another continuation of his domestic policies is that he ironically, by his second and third year, when he's beginning to think about his re-election, he is tough on anti-crime, and he basically funds, through the federal government, a recruitment of 100,000 officers that are scattered across America in basically kind of dangerous cities. This is typically a conservative thing, not a liberal thing. And what made this even more interesting is that Democrats typically are there to provide protections and securities for the marginalized. Who are the marginalized in most situations? Is that of the African American experience. Because of this incarceration, because of this increased funding and more police officers, we see a major incarceration increase of African American men across the landscape. So on one hand it worked, but on the other hand it targeted and manifested itself in horrible numbers and deplorable numbers of African Americans. If by chance you have an opportunity, go on to Netflix, hopefully it's still there, watch 13th it's called, and it really begins to unpack of the unfairness that it is, disproportion of African Americans or blacks that are in prison simply because of laws that have been passed by our government. And Bill Clinton is attributing to that. Well, at the same time, Clinton is also attacking the NRA and opposition, and believes that there needs to be a better set of gun control. What does this stem from? Well, Brady, Jim Brady was his name, and during the Reagan administration, when Reagan was attempted assassination, Brady was there walking beside him as one of his advisors, and a bullet went into his head, barely managed to survive, and the guy was then, relegated to a wheelchair the rest of his life. Well, Brady began to work hard in determining that handguns and background checks should be done. And so this is what the Brady handgun bill had done, is that you need a 5-day waiting period to go through FBI background checks and such to see if you have any emotional distress or other things in your record, as a way to keep guns out of the hands of Americans during that time. They also did an assault ban in 1994 with the use of semi-automatic firearms in the U.S. This law, however, was allowed to expire in 2004, and that's where many families who are big Second Right Amendment families, they go out and enjoy going to the desert and others and shooting their weapons and semi-automatic weapons and cannot get in trouble for that. Here you see Brady there overlooking the shoulder of Bill Clinton as he signs that into law. And I just love this political cartoon here. Please note that I usually really work hard at not showing tipping my hat to what I believe. But look at this here. It says, should we say something about the right to bear arms being void if arms become cheap, plentiful, and can shoot 30 highly accurate rounds in seconds? Nah, how dumb do you think future generations will be? Now, I realize that's tongue-in-cheek, and we recognize that they couldn't have had the foreseeable future of what guns would look like. And this is the contention point for millions of people across the landscape of America. But at this point, the right to bear arms is still free and clear. And some states are more liberal than others. And the federal government typically tries to stay out of that morass, because anybody who's running for president knows that you might have a lot of Democrats on your side voting for you, but the moment you discuss guns, oh boy howdy, those hardcore Democrats they might jump ship and go to the other side because they believe that's an important attribute of our Constitution and rights as Americans. A continued thing that Bill Clinton did, which was very controversial, which I didn't spell correctly. You can see that up here, controversial, but I did this last night, or in the evening, is that he supported these different aspects of bringing jobs away from America and into Mexico. They call that NAFTA, North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. And essentially what NAFTA did is that it reduced all the barriers and the tariffs between Canada and Mexico and allowed a greater degree of free trade. And boy, did it work immeasurably good. It caused our trade with Mexico to go through the roof. What did it also do for people in Mexico? It provided a new emerging middle class with greater degree of pay. And it also might have kept families from leaving Mexico and coming up to the States looking for work. However, what made it controversial to maybe mostly many Republicans is that they felt it took these manufacturing jobs of televisions to brakes to actually building Toyota. There's some Toyota factories in Tijuana and every other places nearby, and Chevy parts are made there, that they feel took jobs away from Americans that they very well could have done to this. Clinton argued a certain position. Ralph Nader said this is going to ruin the environment of those countries where these trade things will take place. And Gingrich believes this was job that were taken away. These are three names that you can look up and be familiar with. If we were in class, we would spend some time looking them up and have their positions more clearly stated on that. And the last thing that was taking place in Europe, many of the countries, I think there were 23 of them, came together under one economic entity, and where they actually signed up and created their own economic money, or their fiat, it's called, their bills, and dropped down the trade and the tariffs and everything else between them as well. And so this was a need that Clinton felt in order for America to be viable and to remain strong, that we needed to counter the European Union with the NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, which still exists today, to make sure the major companies, the major countries, everyone from Russia to India to America to Brazil and so forth, that we have trade policies that will be benefiting to those WTO organizations rather than to the small-time cookies out there. Okay, so his policies, on one hand, were endearing to Republicans. On the other hand, would be endearing to the Democrats or the liberals. And so it's very interesting how this moderate president was moving back and forth in order to get himself reelected during this time. Well, in 1994, he did get reelected, but boy, the American referendum on him was that they were not happy. And for the first time in a long time, 1952, Congress is controlled in both houses of Republicans, which makes it very hard for him to pass what he thought his agendas were going to be. And it gives a new voice, Newt Gingrich, who becomes the minority speaker of the House and begins supporting new conservative methods and belief systems like we saw under Ronald Reagan and under President Bush. Here you can see kind of this idea of NAFTA and this political slogan here, with a shuckster, a kind of a businessman there, decrying the same words of MLK, free at last, free at last. Okay, so here he's saying free trade, thank God we have free trade at last. And that depends on which side of the border or the big side of the coin you look at as well. Both the U.S. workers, they felt they lost hundreds of thousands of jobs, which they did. And then if you're the workers abroad, you feel like you're getting poor wages and it doesn't really, the work is tough and difficult for you. Well, continuing on, when he lost both houses, Clinton had to have a strategy, and the strategy was to become more of a moderate. Not saying he becomes a hardcore Republican, not saying that he continues to press forward the liberal agenda like we saw, with Lyndon Baines Johnson and Kennedy, but he's beginning to, listen to the right side. So he's moderating. And is this a sign of a good president? Is this a sign of a good politician? Maybe so, reaching across the aisle to both sides. It was a very unique president and was liked or spurned because of this. What did he do? Well, he basically, one of the things that he passed is this Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, basically saying if you're on the government paycheck because you're been fired or you're unemployed, etc., the maximum that you can get funds for were 2 years. There frankly were no laws prior to this time dictating how long people could stay or would have to leave. And so there might be families for 20 plus years who've been getting money from the government. The evangelicals or the right, Republican right, were like, when is this ever going to end? When are these folks going to have a chance to, instead of getting a hand out, they need to get a hand up on that. Another thing that he proposed that was really a strong leaning right thing is the Defense of the Marriage Act. This caused every LGBTQ and every kind of liberal to turn over in their grave, if you will. What does this mean? He signed into act that in the military, that the government would only pay for insurance and medical benefits and death benefits for married husband and wife, male and female. It's called DOMA. This was a departure, as I said earlier, from prior things that he had done and supported. So it showed you his compromise. What does this do? Boy, it angered a lot of the LGBT community, but it also ensured that his reelection would happen in 1994 and help his legacy continue on. I have that unhappy face there because it just angered those liberal people's feeling like the president was turning on them. I love this political cartoon over here on the left in dealing with those who were there to get this unemployment. Okay, on the left-hand side, job applicants, you must submit to drug testing and conditions of our employment. And this person over here in the welfare, they're arguing, hey, how's it going, bud? I got my beer and my whiskey and my weed over here. Cheers. And they have to do nothing in order to qualify for this free money. And so that was just a double standard that quite a few conservatives were concerned about during that time. Well, now let's take a look not just at his domestic policy, but how does he begin looking at the global policy. So I guess I should have labeled this into a global policy. And during his time, he encountered, remember, America and Russia are no longer bickering and fighting. Russia has collapsed officially as of Christmas in 1990, 1991. And with that, there is a vacuum. And in that vacuum, we saw a ton of rise between different countries. Civil wars emerge, fighting for who has more power or more land. And one such place took place in these small little countries that nobody had heard of, between people that very few people had heard of, between these Serbians and Croatian minorities and the Muslims that were there, and Christian or Orthodox Christian who were fighting against them. And so we had, at this time, I'm going to go show you this picture here, is that the UN troops, which is what Clinton wisely put forward in there to keep the peace, because if it was seen as an American operation, it would have gone probably a lot differently. But with the United Nations showing up, and sadly too late, you see this conflict escalating. What was the conflict? Well, you had 44% of some of these countries in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which prior were under the Russian leadership, and so as long as the Russians were over, they all maybe had a common enemy and all hated Russia. With them gone, they're now kind of scratching for who's going to be in power. But 44% were Muslim, 31% were Orthodox Christian, and then 17 and 8% were also kind of quasi-Christian. Croatian could be half and half Muslim or Christian, but Yugoslavs typically were Christian. Well, what happened is the Serbs, although they were smaller in percentage, had a military backing and capacity and funding. And they went on this cleansing, they call it, attacking and killing of Muslims living in regions that they wanted the land. In one such town, Srebrenica, they actually killed over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys in the summer of July of 1995. This happened on the watch of our president, on the watch of the United Nations, and it was not at all a good day or a month or a year as these atrocities continue to take place. Again, as well, America has this thing called terrorism emerge on, not necessarily on our soil specifically yet. I'm sorry, cancel that. It does happen on our soil, but it's an event that isn't given, how shall I say it, a whole lot of merit or a whole lot of concern. Okay, I label this as America under siege here. And in 2000, one of our naval destroyers, which is, you know, a huge boat. Take a look at this guy down here in dry dock. I drew a little arrow to him, standing there, you know, clean. Look at the size of that. So this boat was sitting in harbor in this refueling in, I forget the Mediterranean post, I think Tripoli. And it is there that then some terrorists came in, launched a bomb, blew that up, and killed, I think, 17 American soldiers there. And a few years later, the World Trade Center. You say, what? World Trade Center? I thought that was in 2001. No. The first time it was bombed was a guy that put tons of fertilizer into this big van, drove it underneath the World Trade Center, hoping that would then trigger them both to collapse this way. There was, on that same day, there were supposed to be other landmarks that were blown up as well that were foiled by the FBI. But still, America wasn't thinking these terrorists were going to be coming on American soil at that time. In 1998, we have both Kenya and Tanzania, our U.S. embassies, on the same day, at the same hour, were blown up by terrorists. It is a new stage and a new time under Bill Clinton's leadership, and frankly, many people in history have looked back and saying, why didn't he do more when he could have done more? Why didn't he, speak in earlier to what was happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina? I've heard interviews of him since, he is retired as a president, and he says that was one of his deepest regrets, that he did not act sooner, both in the ethnic cleansing, but also with regard to the coal and taking more serious these roles of the terrorist acts that were taking place on America and outside of America as well. Well, part of the reason perhaps why he lost his focus is that he was getting himself in trouble for various things. One of them was this thing called Whitewater, and that's on the left-hand side. So when he and his wife were governors in Arkansas, they began doing some business practices where on inside trading scoop, they learned that certain lands are going to be worth a lot more money because government projects were going to be put in there. That's illegal to do, using your public office for personal gain. Well, he and his wife and others tried to basically obstruct justice for this, and ultimately were found not guilty, but it was certainly brought up to light that there was some shady business dealings going on with the president. Ironically, look at this person here. This is his, it's not his spokesperson, but his, can't think of the title all of a sudden. It's the U.S., it's the one who works with the reporters in the White House, the press secretary. This is Stephanopoulos, who you still see on today's media cycles every night on public, on television, etc. So the second thing that happens, however, is that he has this thing with Monica Lewinsky. Now, in class, I would be showing this 5 minutes of Lewinsky. We don't have that luxury right now. But ultimately, it wasn't that the president had a private affair with this young woman. Yes, there were tons of people who were like, there's a private and a public life responsibility for a president or any public official. But ultimately, what got Mr. Clinton, Bill Clinton, in trouble is that he lied while he was both on television and being interviewed by the FBI, and then he went about obstruction of justice to cover up what was done with regard to the dress and with regard to different statements that were made, etc. And so he essentially was brought forward. I'm sorry, I went the wrong direction. He was brought up for impeachment, and that was approved by Congress, but the Senate failed to get the 2/3 vote to convict him. And frankly, he only had, I think, 4 months left on his term during that. And so they knew that his hand was slapped, that they knew that he couldn't pass any policies. There was a new president coming into office, or elections that were happening. But you need to recognize it was another second president that was up for impeachment. But like Johnson, way, way, way back, Andrew Johnson, if you remember, he was led for impeachment, but they ended up not impeaching him. This is the second president that was impeached, but because of the 2/3 vote, could not do it. Johnson was 1 vote shy. Here was a lot more than that in terms of what he was shy, but nonetheless, he was hand slapped and handcuffed at the same time as president. So there were some good things despite the Monica Lewinsky and the Whitewater thing. It was that we see the unemployment falling courtesy of probably the internet and the growth of American companies with regard to the development of new technology. We see home ownership increasing. In fact, yours truly, Steger, I got our first home in 1995. And that was, a cool experience for my wife and I to have, to no longer rent. We see the stock market going cray-cray, reaching this 10,000 mark. As of this recording, it's almost to hit 30,000 mark. It's crazy how our economy has continued to grow between 3 to 4% a year. But you need to be mindful, or please be knowledgeable, that for many marginalized people, minority people, predominantly black or Hispanic, did not experience these economic progresses that middle class or white or Asian families had experienced during that time period. And that sadly flies in the face of what most Democrats or liberals would want. They want everybody to experience the wealth and the growth, but it did not trickle down as much. The second thing that I want to, really is kind of the third thing, is domestic, his foreign policies now, and then his economic policies. This is really our fourth point here, is that of the computer revolution. And this is something that all of you can probably resonate with and recall. But yours truly was kind of growing up and emerging through this time. There were some early contenders of Microsoft that I can remember when my dad bought into IBM computers. In fact, had a side business in addition to his janitorial. He bought into this IBM franchise, and we were able to sell IBMs out of a business office, and it did well. And then some other things happened that eventually it went belly up. But we got a computer at home, and it was like, what the heck do we do with this? I just want to play games and maybe write a paper, but you had to know how to do coding. It was called Pascal, and you had to do all these different formulas to tell the computer to do things. I'm like, this is lame and boring. Well, along came Bill Gates and his brilliance. He recognized, well, what if people had a mouse and you had folders and you can click and drag and put things into places like that? Brilliant. And so this is what helped the computer go from being just for the really smart, geeky people who knew how to code to every average day slow people like myself. Apple Computer emerged during that time, and I put 1984 because there was a great commercial made during this was when the Summer Olympics were taking place, and so Apple Computer created this amazingly cool dystopian 1984 in reference to, I don't know, it was Fahrenheit 451 or reference to one of those dystopian novels, but how they have come and they're going to shatter all of this dystopian mind control that the government has done. And because that's what the computer does. It ends fascism and it ends all sorts of isms out there. And so it's a really, really cool thing that when we saw that, we were like blown away. And then to see this Apple computer come out that was all condensed into one thing that had only 2 wires, and you click here, click there, and everything worked. Man, it was awesome. We then see the need for microchips and computers getting smaller and smaller and smaller, yet at the same time faster and faster, faster. That's called the Moore law, where you're seeing things faster and smaller and get cheaper as they go through. That was a new economic theory that is like wasn't possibly conceivably possible, but this is what computers had done. And also on the third bullet there, the internet, which had been done and designed by the military to communicate back and forth in case microwave went down or in case the lines went down. This idea of the internet and the use of connected servers was so expensive to do that very, very few corporations could do it. but universities had the opportunity to access this stuff in the mid 80s. And I can remember, and I might have shared this story way back when in another lecture, but I can remember sitting in 1987 in this computer lab, because nobody had money for computers in college, and we had to go to these labs and share space and sign up for them and whatnot. And I can remember in there typing away, and I can hear commotion in the room, and people are laughing, howling, high-fiving, and then I kind of go around and look, and I'm like, what's the big stink? What's going on? They go, we just sent a message to our friends up at Berkeley. What do you mean sent them a message? Yeah, through the computer. We just sent this thing that they call an email. I'm like, oh, okay, I don't know what that means. I got to go back and finish my paper. I had no clue that I had been seeing history kind of in the makings right there in front of me. And so by 1990, there was a guy that, I'm going to show you a picture of him here. His name is, he's now a sir because he's British, and he actually designed this idea of the World Wide Web. And how can we interlink one another and use this interconnected web to begin buying and selling and trading and sharing ideas, etc. This idea blew my mind. I'm like, what the heck are we talking about? And what does that mean? It was a life changer during this time. Because of the World Wide Web, you see major corporations beginning to fight for space, or to fight for opportunities to that space. Who's that space? Me, the consumer. So here you see Apple and Microsoft facing off with other companies that had already faced off and lost. But one important thing is you begin seeing under Clinton, and again, this shows you his moderation. He actually began changing some of the laws, like the Glass-Steagall Act, which basically told banks that investment banks and banks could not work together again, because that's what caused the 1929 collapse. But they could now again. And so those banking systems exploded again, giving options for people and opportunities. What does this do? He also said different companies can begin continuing merging and consolidating, and this created major corporations that gave them greater breadth and depth to it. For instance, Time Magazine, which had like 4 or 5 other magazines at the time, which were important for most people who that's what their medium was of exchanging ideas. And then Warner was a company that owned some, not video stations, but digital stations, cable networks, and as well as stations. They came together in one. And so now they have music, now they have digital, now they have video. They had all sorts of things. This Time Warner company can control and dominate. And it was quite a juggernaut of a power move to consolidate this business into one. Disney now has done that. You know, that's just kind of where companies are going. Apple, look how many different things they're involved in, just to kind of make sure that they stay relative to the market at hand. Now we're getting close to the end, and the next topic is the topic of the changing American population. This website here at the bottom, in class we're going to take some time to look at that. It really goes through and looks, I think, 8 different immigrant experiences. It is incredibly good and cool. I would encourage you, to let's spend some time clicking on this thing here. But because of the technological revolution and more jobs being created as a result of that, both for intellectual property, but also the like Dell Computers, where they're making the computers here on American soil in Texas, we see a need of greater immigrants coming in, not just from Southeast Asia, from India but there's other countries coming in as well. Latin America, South and East Asia, and they're fulfilling gaps in our economy that otherwise perhaps maybe many Americans wouldn't want to do or weren't trained enough to do. For instance, California, the most populated state in the Union, now interestingly enough, the minorities are the whites, where we have the African American, the Asian, and the Latino population exceeding those who had been there as the majority of population since the late 1965 to 68, okay? I'm not saying that's bad or good. I'm just citing that is a definite change there. And of those population in California, 27% of them are first-generation immigrants coming here. A remarkable story of the immigrant experience, okay? I think this immigrant theme is always going to be an important one on the AP exam, so make sure you drill down and understand what is taking place and the changes going on there. This is a chart that I'll talk more about in the class, but you need to be mindful that America has not always been kind and easy to the Chinese with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then excluding women coming from Japan and China, then changing the laws as to if you're Italian, no, you can't come in, but if you're Russian, you can come in, and it just keeps going on and on as to how our Congress determines. But take a look in 1990. The Cold War has come to an end. Immigration begins to just blow into America. Why is that happening? Maybe because the other countries, especially Russia, has just disintegrated. There's no jobs there. All those countries that were part of that umbrella didn't have options and opportunities. So we see a major influx across the board of coming into America because of our policies, etc. This is a really cool website that you can click on that shows you by time period, starting all the way back of when the first immigration began happening into present time. It is cool. I'll play it in class when we're in there together. So to conclude, we need to be mindful that America under Bill Clinton is going through some major changes. One is, how do we continue to be the big police force? And how do we begin handling all these skirmishes and even ugly things like ethnic cleansing? And what is our role in all of that? How do we grow and change our economy and keep jobs for Americans while at the same time having trade with the rest of the other globe? And also fight for the rights of those who can't speak up and defend for themselves, namely the LGBTQ community, of which kind of Bill Clinton dropped the ball on, even though he was considered a liberal and a Democrat of that time. So America still continues in flux. America still continues to ebb and flow. And next time, we're going to find out how we finish up on the very last lecture of this year. Woo-hoo, woo-woo! Yeah! Well, keep it classy, Golden Bears. We'll see you next time.